welcome back to Liminal Frames. This is episode 9 of the show. 9 feels like a good number. I've had a good week. Exo, how has your week been?
Well, my week's been good, but there's a lot going on in my life right now, and some exciting things I'll be able to talk about more in the future, but happy to step in and join you on this episode.
Nice. All right, well, I already know that you're a future human, so hopefully it's something.
Oh, it's out. It's exposed.
Secret is out of the bag. I really enjoyed your most recent episode on Point of Convergence on the breakaway civilization. Hopefully we can talk about that at some point, either on this episode or down the road. But today we are going to get into what I guess we're calling, or we've talked about calling, civil disagreement, or on discourse and disagreement. This is a pretty topical sort of discussion because, as I think folks know, our social media spaces, our current climate in the world is pretty polarized. There's a lot of passions are high, and when it comes to beliefs, and we often sort of find ourselves on opposite sides of a perspective, and the way in which we engage with each other, either in person or in our social media spaces, is very much, I think, changing. I think it's hard to argue that we have not been influenced by these technologies. We have not been influenced by just the things that are happening in our world today with the pandemic and climate change and civil unrest and the war in Ukraine. There are a lot of things going on, and of course there are things happening at every moment in history. But for whatever reason, I think maybe because of our hyperconnectivity, the things that are happening right now feel a lot more salient and personal, and that kind of keeps us on edge. Also, in recent news, if anybody who's been in the Twitter sphere has been paying attention, that Elon Musk has offered to buy Twitter, and it sounds like they've accepted that proposal. And Elon I know him in and of himself, he's a polarizing figure, but he's made it very clear that what he wants to try to do with Twitter is make it a space that is more pro free speech. And that has been interpreted from both sides of kind of the political aisle in different ways. Some people are, heading for the exits from Twitter. Others are coming back to Twitter. It's definitely impacting the feel. And I've seen folks even on both sides of the aisle here also, kind of champion this move and think that it could be a net positive. So, but at the end of the day, it does feed into this topic generally. And that's, how do we kind of engage in a discussion that can lead to a meaningful conversation? How do we engage when we disagree with one another? How do we do that in a way that can be productive and not counterproductive? So, Exo, I know that's quite a lot to sort of set the table, but what's your take on the sort of way in which we engage with each other today, in particular when we don't happen to agree?
Right. Well, I wrote down 37 points you made, so I'll make sure I touch base on each one.
Excellent.
Yes, that's a very loaded question. The thing with Elon Musk is just a fascinating historic moment in so many ways. There's so many implications, ramifications of that. Some people point to the fact that a very short list of billionaires now own huge amounts of our media, right? Newspapers, online platforms, etc., TV networks. And that in itself is somewhat concerning, even if whether you're pro Elon Musk or not in terms of the free speech versus more control over what's said. It's still somewhat concerning that, 4 or 5 guys, which is pretty much what it is, based on their preferences, can shape the nature of our media spectrum entirely for everyone else, right? That's just concerning in itself. Even if one of them happens to champion your particular perspective, surely all of us should be concerned of that kind of oligarchical kind of, setup.
Mm-hmm.
I think about that. I think about how, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even, you had your Walter Cronkites of the world. Everyone tuned into one or two or three or four TV networks, and that became the sum total of how information was released and how people consumed information and media, and to a great degree, their understanding of what was going on in the world and what reality was, right? And then we had, cable television and then the internet. And now we have a situation where we have this polarization and culture wars where people don't just listen to the same media and draw different conclusions. They consume completely different media and therefore exposed to completely different media set or data sets about what's even happening. And they tend to, you get this kind of compounding echo chamber effect, where you're only talking to people who already agree with you. And so, and that tends to further polarize everything, for instance, in our country. And to the point where not only do you see the other political party, for instance, as not holding the right beliefs about a political persuasion, but you suddenly identify them with everything dark and demonic and sexually perverse. Like you make them the Darth Vader, of the world, kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. Um, Partly because just, from a sheer psychological point of view, it makes you feel better about yourself if you can make, you feel like Luke Skywalker if you make the other Darth Vader, right? And that
Mm-hmm.
happens on both sides, to be quite frank, as you like to say. So it is a very, very complex situation when you then get into a situation where, and this, relates to Elon Musk stepping in, because you've got these media platforms like Twitter that have effectively become the town square, right? Where we voice opinions. And so this balance between free speech versus protecting vulnerable communities is sort of like at the heat of this, right? And even people who claim they are for free speech, often what they're really saying is, I want my particular free speech to be out there. And they're very
Mm-hmm.
comfortable quashing somebody else's free speech. And again, I see that on both sides of the equation. So there's even a lack of like consistency, logical consistency, and self-awareness going on mass levels. It's a conundrum. And when a private media platform suddenly feels like it's its job to be the moral police for the entire society, on the one hand, I understand why they feel that need, because what's said on their platform can impact elections and everything else. At the same time, is that really their role? And if it's not their role, whose role is it? These are really fascinating and complex questions, and I'm looking forward to us unwinding it a bit tonight.
Definitely. Well, what I find interesting about this too is that when you talk about the climate now, it's not uncommon in conversation, even with a stranger, for you to quickly get to a place where you're both saying something is wrong here. Something just doesn't seem right. The way that there's a lot of animosity in our social media, and in our media generally. People seem to be aware on some sort of cognitive level that this isn't really a representation of how dialogue truly is with another person. That it's like a caricaturized version of dialogue. So it's like we all, on an individual basis, I think, acknowledge and can readily see there's a problem here with the way that it manifests on these platforms, but we seemingly, lack the collective power to sort of effectuate something that would be a meaningful change, influencing the needle to something that would be, kind of more friendly or productive. Um, and I recognize too that there are, just as you pointed out, there are a lot of power dynamics here. So it's not necessarily true that the majority is right. The majority. In fact, we have lots of instances in history when majorities in certain societies have really been, kind of wrong in various ways when it comes to their marginalization of minorities or persecution of minorities. I think we would objectively look at that and say that wasn't okay. So, creating platforms that really just sort of elevate a majority consensus opinion isn't necessarily, the best thing. And these are questions that I think technology companies are also not necessarily well equipped to answer. They're not in the business of trying to, sort of run societies or speak on behalf of states interacting with other states and state power. They're in the free marketplace of ideas, and they're just kind of in the business of making money. So their operational incentives are really quite different, or at least in some ways different than our governments. And so we're kind of placing upon them this burden of having to figure this out on the fly and preserve, at least in the U.S., preserve our republic, if we feel that republic is under threat. And then there are those that would say, maybe it needs to be, right? Maybe we need to, kind of let these sort of things play out as they will, and let the sort of chips fall where they may. I don't know. There doesn't seem to be like any ready, easy answers here. Whether you think Elon Musk is, a great guy or not, it certainly seems like a smart guy. But I don't think Elon has a silver bullet here to solve this problem.
Yeah, it's by the way, as a quick aside, based on our usual topic of the UFO phenomenon, which we'll move to in a minute, I've actually heard people somewhat only half jokingly say they wonder if Elon Musk is actually an alien, perhaps a reptilian. Um, but yeah, it is interesting, and like you touched on with the media platforms thing, in many ways, it's living in an environment that has superseded the nation state structure, right? So we still have nation states, but when you have actors within certain countries trying to manipulate with bots and whatnot, the election process in another country, and they're not necessarily even official state actors, but they're still tied to a certain nation state often and a certain worldview. It becomes very, very complex. And then because then who's the karma police for who? Very complex question. Yeah, and like you say, I don't think there's any easy answers. Like we're definitely not here to say, okay, we've got Exo and Nathan have our 5-step plan for how we can fix this tonight, because there are no simple answers. And if there's one thing I would really want to impress upon people is that whenever you try and salvage one kind of value or ideal, you often have to sacrifice another, at least to some degree. Like there's always a trade-off, so free speech versus protecting people, that is a complex equation, and there are no simple answers. I resist the notion that there is one. I just don't think there is. You have to give and take in that, and there are major implications in the negative if you skew too far on either side of that equation. So it's this ongoing wrestling we're just going to have to do as a culture and in real time.
Yes, I mean it's. I think it's a mature position to take that rules are helpful, but not necessarily, uh, sort of always set in stone. They can't be so rigid that they can't adapt or flex to other imperatives that arise. Um, but coming back to something you touched on a second ago, I mean, why is this important for us to tackle this topic? So like why, you and I have had a lot of conversations, and I think those of us, those of you who've listened to our show, or any of our content separately, probably see a lot of commonality between the two of us. We're not exactly meeting up and kind of duking it out in terms of our perspectives. But why is this topic of kind of disagreement or navigating disagreement, why is this important to us?
Yeah, good question. And I'm reminded of a political show that was on in the past. It might have been the 90s or the 2000s, called Crossfire, and that's exactly what it was. It was like just basically enemies, like attacking each other for like 30 minutes. Um, well, I think this topic, number one, we always talk about nuance. I don't think you'll ever hear a show where we don't mention that word. Um, and I think we both, because we've been through transitions of our own worldviews, where we actually see the world and reality differently than our former selves, we it makes you more wary of really concretized perspectives. Um, I think you get to a point where you hold even your current view you hold much more lightly. You take it seriously, but you hold it lightly, and you sort of develop the inclination to look for outlier data that might question your current perspective, because if it's been happened to you before, chances are it'll happen again, right? Um, and in this particular field, the UFO phenomenon and paranormality, which is our mainstay, uh, conspiracy theories are everywhere, right? And we are in a field where, on the one hand, you've got some pretty outlandish claims that, on the face of it, sound almost preposterous. On the other hand, I think if you've been in this field for any period of time, you see clear evidence of historic government, not only cover ups, but oppression, repression of people who tried to resist that cover up, even potentially, assassination of people, ruining people, definitely, based on their desire to try and expose the truth. Uh, so and this topic is related to many other conspiracies too. In other words, just demographically, this is not a value statement. I'm just saying, when you look at the statistics, the people who are interested in the phenomenon skew towards conspiracy theories in general, right? Whether it's 9/11 being an inside job, or the Kennedy assassination, or the secret space, force kind of thing. Um, all of these are associated with ufology. On the one hand, because, again, I think once you sort of, like you mentioned that phrase, "Fool me once, shame on you; fool me twice, shame on me." That's the sort of the perspective you take. But at the same time, you don't want to start seeing a demon behind every bush, to use another, analogy of a phrase. In other words,
Mm.
just because one conspiracy theory has been proven to be true doesn't mean you should just write a blank check and say that every conspiracy theory you ever come across therefore must also be true. But admittedly, to try and have a critical eye to, and that doesn't mean negative, it just means really be willing to delve into the evidence, and see what actually supports one position or another, is challenging. And I think people sometimes experience intellectual fatigue because they just don't know what to believe anymore, right? Like, even for experiencers, you've been brought up to believe one thing about reality, and then suddenly gray aliens show up at the end of your bed. And even for a guy like, Jim Semivan, who worked for the CIA, it happens to a guy like that, right? And what does that do for not just the question of aliens and what they are and what they're doing here, but everything about reality is suddenly in play. And so I think those of us who really delve into this, inevitably end up asking questions, really open questions about a lot of topics, and that just sort of par for the course.
Definitely. Well, I find it interesting. So I can understand why, if you've had an experience, a direct experience of something strange, that you would really exhibit a strong degree of conviction about that. I've seen something. Don't tell me what I've seen. I know what I've seen, and this is what it means. So I can really understand a strong opinion in that situation. What I think I have a harder time understanding is folks who have incredibly strong opinions about sort of topics or conspiracies that there isn't necessarily a lot of clear data that you could point to and say, look, here it is, to sort of back up whatever it is that they're saying. But so many are just heavily invested in particular positions, to the exclusion, and sometimes the almost violent exclusion of other viewpoints on the topic, even viewpoints that might happen to have similar perspective, just not the same. So I've always struggled with that, and I kind of, for me, it's like trying to understand the sort of motivations or the personality traits that contribute to that type of behavior, So I definitely would like to get your thoughts on that. What's going on there? Like why that heavy investment in something that just doesn't seem to be, very clear cut.
Yeah, it's a good question. And there's definitely, a lot of evidence for cognitive bias everywhere you look. I think part of it comes down to people want people want answers, right? People don't like ambiguity. They don't like well, when the evidence right now looks, like 52% one way, 48% another way, right? That's really not just does it lack resolution, but it creates cognitive dissonance. Like it just doesn't feel good to
Mm.
for that to be the case. And when you think about the human brain and even how when we see optical illusions, even sometimes when we know it's an optical illusion, it's been demonstrated to us that we can't argue with it. We still can't get our brain to see it as an optical illusion. It still looks like reality to us. And it's almost like we've been hardwired from an evolutionary point of view. We have been hardwired from an evolutionary point of view to come down in blacks and whites, right? Partly because that was an evolutionary trait to keep us alive. When the lion's coming, you can't sit there pondering the ambiguity of what it is, right? You just got to make a move, and if you're wrong, well, at least you're alive, right? But if you think too hard about it, then you're dead. So that's part of our evolutionary history. So when we have these really complex topics now, I think it goes against the grain of our evolution to some degree to just sort of step back, take the 30,000-foot view, and just say, I'm on pause and gathering data until there is more clarity. Yeah, it's probably the thing that frustrates me the most about this field. And we were talking about this before we went on the air, that even when I, on my podcast, state very clearly that I think we should resist the temptation to collapse multiple possibilities into one or two, like a binary option, right? I see people
Mhm.
doing it all the time. Sometimes in the very podcast I just said it, I'll get comments that sound like they want to do that. So, so that suggests to me that some people aren't even self-aware that they're doing it, and you can literally say it to them, and it goes in one ear and out the other, and they just don't know how to practice it. Now, part of it maybe is our academic background. Like I remember even in psychology, we were taught that, when you see a study that, or even Mark Twain, right, said that there's three kinds of lies, right? There's lies, damn lies, and statistics, right? And the point there is that just because someone shows you statistics doesn't mean you should take it as the gospel truth, right? Because who's funding the study? What kind of protocols were there to make sure it was a fair and blind study, right? So, and if for instance the tobacco industry is authoring a study and paying for it on the damaging nature of nicotine, you might right away say there's a strong possibility here that they have a preferred conclusion, right? Those kind of
Mhm.
things. So I think we should absolutely do that with the UFO phenomenon and paranormality. We should say who's saying this, not just what are they saying, but who's saying it and what's their background and why might they not only consciously skew one way, but maybe even unconsciously skew one way, where they're not necessarily deliberately lying or deceiving themselves or deceiving you, but they just haven't developed the capacity to look with really discerning critical vision at data and be aware of their own tendency to prefer one hypothesis or conclusion over another.
I think too, like arriving at a place where you could go through those motions and sort of put yourselves in the shoes of that person and say, based on what I know about them, I understand how they arrived at that conclusion. I understand why they hold that perspective. I disagree with that, but I understand it. I understand that. I know that sometimes that can sound a little bit condescending, like, well, if you only understood it like I did, then you'd have a different perspective. That's not really what I'm getting at. I think it's just more so saying it's this recognition that we all live in a kind of a state of flux in our various sort of uh, narrative realities. We like to sort of paint this picture that there might be this kind of objective truth that's just sort of sitting there like a box in a room, and we can all look at it. and it's, there's the box, that's the truth. And I think it's closer to true that it depends on where you are in the room, what it is that you're seeing. And just acknowledging that fact that that person may be at another side of the room and may have a different perspective on it, and it may also be okay. It may be in some ways correct from their vantage point. And what is the value and utility of that? It's funny that you brought up illusions, because I meant to put that in the show notes. Yes, folks, we do have show notes that we don't necessarily follow, but I meant to put that in the notes. And so I'm glad that you brought it up. So thank you. But we were, the family and we took a trip recently, and there was this sort of, they called it the Museum of Illusions. And immediately going inside that place, have all these different types of illusions that you can see. And it very quickly confirmed for me that there's very little that we can trust in our own sort of perceptual experience. That we are just so easily duped by what it is that is, coming at us. And so that ties into, of course, a ton of things that I think we've talked about and will continue to talk about in terms of what is true and how we, verify what is true. But I thought that was in a little bit of a synchronicity that you brought that up, because it is complicated. It is multifaceted. In some ways, to me, it's kind of it's strange that we live in a time that allows us to have this understanding, that this level of complex understanding, that we can be easily duped, that we have access to all this different information. You did just mention, like who funded the study, and like these are questions that not every generation which preceded us actually asked or even was aware of. So we live at a time where I think our awareness of this is kind of better than it's ever been, and you would think that would cause us to be more understanding of one another, but it actually doesn't seem to be the case at all. It seems to contribute to a lot of tribalism and, kind of this retreating to our corners and saying, well, I know you're on that side of the box, but I'm over here and I really like it over here. Over here is the best place to be. And from where I'm standing, that's not a box. It's a triangle, and I don't want to hear from anybody that tells me otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. It's it is complex, and like you say, it's one thing to know something even statistically, but to actually manage to change your behavior based on that knowledge is another thing entirely. It is interesting that for the first time in history, like you say, we know many things about our evolutionary background and how that skews our ability to perceive reality correctly. And we've talked before about Donald Hoffman's work, where he's demonstrated, pretty convincingly, that even through mathematical proofs and whatnot, that almost certainly what we perceive is more like a desktop interface rather than the actual perception of what reality really is or what's really out there. And again, that was an evolutionary move made to keep us alive, to show us just enough, a close approximation of only the most important elements of what's out there so that we would survive to, propagate the species and such. So we have all sorts of evidence like we've never had before to tell ourselves that what we see, how we perceive, is, I mean, we already knew, like, in terms of the bandwidth, right, and how much we visually perceive and things like that. It's so narrow compared to what actually exists, right? And when you get into the infrared, you see all sorts of things that we don't usually perceive. But we're talking about much more than that. We're saying that even those, these great devices we come up with, more and more powerful telescopes, more and more powerful microscopes, the more we look at the quantum level and things break apart to the idea that they become more like probabilities waves rather than physical things, right? We have less and less confidence even that reality is real in many ways, in other words, the question goes to the deepest levels, and unless you're Monty Python saying, it's turtles all the way down, man, that's the answer. There is no simple answer. And so in the midst of this really compelling question about the UFO phenomenon, these others who apparently are in our midst and are interacting with us and their presence seems to be ramping up. In the midst of all that and those questions, we have coincidingly vast questions about what reality is, who we are, the
Mm.
biggest questions of all. And so, and when people, are trying to live their lives and, make their way through the world in the few decades that we're here, not that many people have the luxury to step back and consider these really, really big questions. And so they tend to go down one track, and that kind of, the second you take that track, that limits the possibilities, and that sort of feeds the conflict with other groups who've taken a different track. And I like what you said about, it's not about being right or wrong. Sometimes it's about just literally seeing something from different perspectives. And I've used this word before, multi-perspectival. Like, part of my integral background has taught me that it's not about which group has the right view. It's what is right about each group, and how can we synthesize a much more robust understanding that takes the best of all of those models and truth models, right? Spiritual truth models, and
Mm-hmm.
what we've learned from science, and all of that. Because the frustrating thing with history is that we usually, when we come into a new understanding, partly in kind of like a shadow move, rejecting almost out of embarrassment who we used to be, who our ancestors used to be, we reject that entire series of revelations that they lived under and adopt the new
Mm-hmm.
one wholeheartedly, and at first don't apply any of critical thinking to the new thing, almost like a kind of penance. It's a really strange psychological move we make, both as individuals and as a collective. But what I've learned is much more helpful is to recognize, if large groups of people found truth in a certain perspective for long periods of time, there's probably something there. And as Ken Wilber likes to say, everybody's right. In other words,
Mm.
everybody's right to some degree. If it held sway for a period of time, whether it's shamanic culture or, the Reformation or, the Enlightenment or whatever, there's probably something to it. How can we synthesize, build up a larger truth that takes the best of all of that? And I would love to see that happen more often around the UFO phenomenon and paranormality.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I don't think I do not think it's coincidental that these points are really converging right now. That as you mentioned, we've got this, more levels of free time, or awareness of the ways in which we are integrated, the way that our perceptions influence what we understand to be true or not true. It's not a coincidence that time in our history is also coinciding with the bigger questions of, like, what is happening with all of these experiences that have been reported in modern and in ancient history. We're reflecting on this, and as we reflect on that, it actually makes room and space for that to become, in a sense, more real than it had been. Like, in a way, it's almost manifesting it. Um, and so, to kind of, as we're pivoting to looking at the UFO and high strangeness specifically, with respect to disagreements and political disagreements, I do find it particularly interesting that we are in a time where, when in the U.S. at least, when the right and the left are really looking for any excuse they can find to demean, devalue, attack, and belittle the other to gain political points, the one topic that they seem to be pretty consistently on the same page is UAP, and trying to understand what this UAP stuff is. And I've heard the cynical argument on that is, well, they realize that we're behind the curve somehow, that drones, are everywhere, and we've got to do something about it. And so, to sort of save face, we're entertaining this notion of, it could be some advanced, alien species or something. And that allows us to kind of sidestep our negligence and culpability, and allowing the drone threat to become more prevalent. But honestly, I find that hard to believe as well, because as recently as a couple of weeks ago, I saw a Republican lawmaker absolutely just grill the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, on C-SPAN over how we handled the Afghanistan withdrawal. So you can't tell me that we don't have some folks in some parties, and that was just one example. I'm sure that there are plenty on the left side that were grilling, the Trump administration for certain things that they did. We're not afraid to go after incompetence if it's perceived in our military operations, because a lot of our military appointees are civilian. They're not necessarily military members themselves. So all that said, having a lot of agreement and co-sponsorship of bills and efforts to understand what UAP actually are and improve and enhance our collection there, to me, that says a lot about the sort of validity of the subject itself. And it's refreshing, quite frankly. This is one area of our, sort of society where we could actually agree. We could model how to come together and effectuate some positive change for our people, and hopefully kind of kickstart a new way of interacting with each other in a more healthy way.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're talking about that there, I was reminded of that famous speech that Ronald Reagan gave, where he said, if there's one thing that could end the Cold War and unite the human civilization, it would be an extraterrestrial threat. Which again, when you think about it, it's all about changing perspective, right? And I remember this situation where there was a high school teacher who was noticing a lot, and I think they were teaching sociology or something like that, and they were noticing a lot of like cliquiness kind of in their classroom, like one group, the jocks against the rockers, against the nerds or whatever. And so he wanted to demonstrate, and a great teacher. So rather than trying to teach them about sociology, he actually used them as guinea pigs to show them how it works. So basically, he just became increasingly capricious towards them in terms of what he expected from them, and he was unpredictable in terms of when he gave quizzes, when he gave homework, and so he just united the class against him, right? So these different cliques within the classroom became unified against the evil teacher who was being so capricious and unfair. And at the end of the class, at the end of the year, he explained to them what he was doing and what he was trying to teach them. And that, again, we reflect back on Ronald Reagan's speech, that absolutely sometimes what it takes to end an argument is for a more overarching issue to come online, right? To come into our awareness. And you could even argue, you could play with the notion anyway, that some of these intelligences that we're dealing with are aware of our conflict, our tribalism, and how dangerous it is. Like I don't think our country has ever been so close to civil war since the Civil War is now. That maybe them showing up and maybe the ramping up that's even happening, which I would argue from a data-driven point of view is seems to be taking place right now. There seems to be, from what I'm hearing from numerous sources, there's a ramping up going on. And you could at least play with the notion that our current economic, political, sociological divisions, when you tie that with, we've always been divided, but when you tie it to our capacity to destroy ourselves, when you talked about the pandemic, whether it's an architected virus that gets released or nuclear bombs or whatever, so many ways we could really, really destroy our civilization, that maybe this is one way, just by showing up, just by making their presence known, which forces us to ask the question, who are they? What does this mean in terms of who we are? How does this impact the big questions? It changes the equation, maybe gets us to change the nature of our arguments, and we focus on something more overarching, like you say, that we can all agree with, because it's one of the very few topics, like you say, where there's agreement across the aisle, as they say.
Mm-hmm. Well, how important is it that until we have better information, clearer information, and we can talk about kind of the avenues of information distribution or validity How important is it in today's day where we don't yet have better data to all agree? To me, it seems like it's healthy and maybe should be even encouraged that we entertain, foster different perspectives within the community of interest. So for me, it it's healthy for us to take these different, have these different opinions. What I find to be unhealthy is the way in which those opinions are either expressed or wielded like weapons against those that have an alternate take. So to me, if we're going to, and I guess, this is a topic we could hit on as well. Like, how important is it that we have a community that reflects a diversity of opinion? So is that a value that we really should strive for? Or is it better that we just, to use the word that you used a few minutes ago, kind of congregate in our little cliques of like-minded, thinkers, and just kind of put up the walls and defend those walls against those who don't have our perspective? Maybe that's what we should do. Maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe, having a diverse set of perspectives and allowing people to come to the table with those perspectives in a respectful, healthy way, maybe that's not great. Maybe it's better that, people just retreat to their corners of UFO Twitter and, kind of stay out of each other's lanes. I mean, that to me, that's not, that doesn't, ring true. It doesn't feel like that's the right way to go about it. It feels like we are made better by having that conversation, by listening, by reevaluating our positions, on a regular basis. I often wonder those that are the most vocal, regardless of their perspective, who are, basically kind of shouting back at each other, what's really going on there? What is really at stake in the situation? Because, to me, it sort of is a mask for some sort of underlying issue that isn't expressed. It's kind of a defense mechanism in a way. Maybe they've just invested, so much time and energy in a particular perspective that to admit that they might be wrong is kind of an admission of defeat, or like a psychological break, because they're just not willing to entertain that. So I don't know. I guess what I'm searching for here is, and I ask this a lot on the shows that I'm on, is, what are some models, what are some things we can look to help us, have this discussion in a way that is respectful of differing opinion and even encouraging of different opinion without it becoming inflamed. I don't know what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there are numerous ways that I would address that. One is when you think about the notion of a debate, that in itself suggests that, two opposite parties will argue back and forth, and one of two options will come out on top, right? Like it assumes right away that there's a yes or a no, a black or white binary kind of truth that we can get to with a debate. So even in the notion of a debate has underlying assumptions about the nature of truth or reality, right? Versus a dialogue or conversation, right? And you brought up an interesting point that's worth paying attention to, and that's you use the term psychological break. I think we do have to be sympathetic to people, because for some people, they've already been through that, like sometimes with an experience of the phenomenon or paranormality. They, it literally not only changed their perspective on reality, but even your sense of personal agency, right, can be so violated. Not only do think things seem to supposedly have control over you, but you can't even get the mainstream to believe it's even happening. How could you describe a more hopeless feeling, right? Where you have no agency whatsoever. And maybe the one thing you feel like you have left to do is convince everybody else that this is malevolent and nefarious and we got to wake up, right? And so you can understand if people are coming from that perspective, they have a lot of skin in the game, right? And I think we have to be not only sympathetic to that, but we have to listen closely. Like even if you tend either to them being mostly good or mostly bad, listen to the side who's making the counter argument. Like listen closely. Don't listen and go, I'm waiting for the thing that I can pick apart to prove that I'm right. Really
Mm-hmm.
approach it with the mentality that you want to learn something, right? And really ask yourself, am I here? Is my demeanor, is my intention here to learn something, or am I here to win, right? Um, so again, we've talked about this before in the show. A lot of this comes down to self-awareness, right? Being aware of how you enter into an equation, a conversation, a discussion, a forum. What is it you're hoping to gain from it? Um, some people would argue that while you and I kind of embrace this multi-perspectival view and say there's something we can all learn from each other, and there's probably shreds of truth in multiple perspectives, some people would say that in itself is kind of propaganda from a certain position, and it's true, right? Like we would acknowledge
Mm-hmm.
that we all have to begin with some baselines about reality and how we should navigate the world, and ours happens to be that we have a more cosmopolitan kind of view where we believe that it's helpful and we get further ahead by being exposed to different views. But not everyone agrees with that. Some people think that, for instance, like we've said many times before, those who are convinced that any of these entities that it seem to be interdimensional or not conventionally either human or animal, just by definition must be bad news. And to even talk about it, to even have the conversation, is to give it more power. In the same way that you talked about, us merely being exposed to this and talking about it may create a kind of feedback loop that concretizes it and helps it manifest all the more in our reality. There are some people who are convinced of that to the negative, that
Mm-hmm.
even having these conversations like is opening doors for nefarious things to come in and impact us more and more and more. And so the best thing, the kindest and most apt response is to just shut down the conversation, which is the opposite of what we're saying, right? So we, in being multi-perspectival, have to acknowledge that is a perspective that we at least need to consider and evaluate. Complex questions. Not everyone will agree with us. We're saying this is what we hope people will lean towards. Even for me, I'll expose myself a bit here and say that, like, even politically, I consider myself post-progressive. So I'm looking for some sort of transcendent synthesis of viewpoints that transcend our current polarization that we have in our culture. And I think that's very much possible. And again, that's partly my integral background. But again, because people have skin in the game, because some people, especially in this field, recently saw someone who, you probably saw it too, won't name them, but someone who had, scarring on the back of their head because of what apparently was an interaction with a UAP, and when you see that, how it like changes someone's life, in a way that's irreversible in many ways, you can understand that for someone like that, it doesn't sit well when someone comes in without any experience with the phenomenon and has these really strong views. So there are many things to consider here. We have to be empathetic. I hope we'll be open-minded, and I hope we actually spend time like intentionally hearing opposite perspectives and giving them the time of day, like really evaluating it with an open mind.
Mm-hmm. And history often is like the determiner of what was maybe appropriate at the time, right? So it is interesting to think about this from that vantage point, because you could argue that kind of holding things in suspension like we are pretty good at doing may very well be from a historical perspective like the wrong position to take. Historically it could be better that we we really literally fight hard for a particular perspective, and that by kind of playing the fence or whatever, that's just not really the better outcome. And I do struggle with that. I guess I also sort of think of it from the standpoint of At least this has helped me, particularly in relationships that with friends who maybe I have some kind of strong ideological disagreements with. It's helped me to look at this from that evolutionary perspective, that like an evolutionary psychology in a way, that we're all wired and maybe predisposed in certain ways. Some are predisposed to be more kind of binary, or kind of have a strong sense of justice or a need for judgment. Some are predisposed to be a lot more ambiguous and open to sort of new experiences. Our tolerance for new experiences may be a lot higher. That's kind of some. It's part of who we are. It's not necessarily something that we can cognitively change. Once we're aware of it, we can kind of modulate that some. But if we're not aware of it, which most of us aren't most of the time, those factors just sort of influence the way we move through the world. And there are times in our evolutionary history and our present in which those traits contribute to our survival, not just as an individual in a certain situation, but potentially as a species. And so that perspective, for me at least, it allows me to tolerate those that I find to be a little bit too intolerant, if that makes sense. Because I kind of say, that's not who I am. I can't really get that worked up about X, Y, Z, but I kind of understand why they are, and maybe that's okay. Maybe that is even correct, but maybe other times those folks, need to take a back seat to a more open to new experience view, a more willingness to change view that I might bring to the table. And so, it's interesting to me kind of how all of this kind of plays together on a topic that is a little bit of a lightning rod. And I guess I wanted to ask you too, what's your intuition? Do you think that the others, and obviously we could be a whole bunch of different, sort of others that are out there, but what does your intuition say? Do you think that some or all of them have gone through this kind of same process in their own, journey as a species or as an entity or whatever? And if you think that that's true, is there a trajectory to that? You have a sense that there might be a path there.
Yeah, good question. And I think this, what you're asking there points to, I think, one of the constants that I lean towards, right? When we talked about, I mean, you can't wake up in the morning and put your socks on without some underlying beliefs about reality, right? And even science has certain untestable assumptions upon which it's built, right? That's just the nature of any hypothesis you put forward has to say, give me these givens, these baselines, and from that I'll try and construct a model of reality, right? That's what physics is. It tries to model reality. But you get down to the root level, and it has to begin with assuming this is the case. Let's see if we could build something, right? And so again, touching on Donald Hoffman again, he says, I'm going to approach it differently. Give me consciousness. Assume consciousness is primary. Then let me see if I can build everything else: matter, energy, space, time. And he believes he can, right? And so he's trying to look at it from that perspective, but he's not making any more leaps than someone who begins by saying, matter and the material world is primary, right? But to get to what you were asking there, yes, my tendency is to, and this does shape how I see the phenomenon. And I had this perspective before I ever became interested in this topic. And again, it goes back to my integral background and the notion of spiral dynamics. And I've talked about this on Point of Convergence a few times. This notion that there does seem to be a directionality to evolution. And I'm not just talking about what our bodies evolve to look like and do, but I mean, even our consciousness seems to evolve to be interested in ever expanding circles of inclusion and concern. So again, we've discussed before that you go from me-centric, and this happens both for us as individuals as we grow up and move through different levels of understanding, but also as collective cultures, we go through this as well. Going from me to my family, to my tribe, to my nation state, to my species, to all sentient life on the planet, to all sentient life in the cosmos, and even maybe this notion that everything is actually ultimately a manifestation of one underlying substrate of consciousness. Therefore, everything's connected. So my self-interest now is directed towards everything. That what happens to Nathan at that level should impact me as much as what happens to me. So that literally changes my definition of self-interest. Um, and my perspective is, again, you can see, even with human civilization, that cultures go through these predictable stages. Like you can see it mapped out time and time again. Um, and so one of my underlying assumptions, because again, we all bring some of them to the table, is that this is more like a universal constant. That underlyingly, I do believe consciousness is primary. Everything else sort of comes from that. And because of that, yes, these others, regardless of whether they're interdimensional or extraterrestrial or time travelers or shadow biome beings or whatever, they are also part of that consciousness, because literally everything is part of that consciousness. So I do believe that that kind of trajectory holds true across the board. That said, I also acknowledge that there are different kinds of intelligence, different kinds of sophistication. And just like you can get a new age guru who might really, really, really understand meditation and be able to get to subtle reality to an amazing degree and even teach it to others, who might be just a jerk, just not have good social skills, might be a complete narcissist. Some people think, how can both of those exist in one person? Well, because it's a different kind of intelligence, and you can excel in one, and sometimes almost like as a consequence, really be stunted in another. So again, this is where self-awareness and shadow work helps to sort of round out not only increasing your strengths, but also working on your weaknesses. So yes, my notion, and I'm glad you brought this up, because we talked about this before we went on the air, and that is that for me, even when people draw these hard distinctions between, are these physical beings or are they spiritual? So for me, I've always tended towards this notion. And this even goes back to science fiction I've written in the past and read in the past as well, where my notion is, as that circle of inclusion increasingly gets larger and larger, and not only that, but your ability to manipulate reality gets larger and larger, because you become more, not only can you manipulate physical reality like we can really well now, but on top of that, when you get to a level where you now perceive reality on a consciousness level, so that you can manipulate it energetically without ever having to get to the point where you just now work with dead matter, then at that point you might evolve into a kind of hyperspace or a hyperdimensional reality where you maybe are post-biological, right? But the whole time this is happening, you are recognizing that everything is connected, and as such, you now have become a being who exists mostly as a light being, who is post-biological, and yet is connected not only to everything, but also is very, very in tune with this central cosmic intelligence. Because again, that's one of my assumptions. I think there's strong evidence for the fact that there is an underlying cosmic intelligence behind everything. Some people want to use the term God for that. For some people, that's just too loaded a term with religious baggage and whatnot. So use your term of choice. But as they become in tune with all those things and grow in all those capacities, to me, they then may, out of their own sense of much larger self-interest, act on behalf of the will of this cosmic intelligence. And when you think about it, that looks an awful lot like what we would call an angel, right? It's a light being, it's post-biological, it's in tune with the cosmic intelligence, its will is aligned with the cosmic intelligence because it's evolved to that degree. And yet it's still part of the evolutionary process of our cosmos. So that's where, for me, I feel like those hard distinctions collapse, and other possibilities that are more interesting to me come online.
Mm-hmm. Well, what are the attributes of that consciousness at large? I guess I do struggle with that aspect because, is it as if in this sort of conscious evolution that there's there's a kind of trigger point or a line that gets crossed in that journey to where, as you kind of point out, that this greater alignment occurs, and behaviorally, these entities, are almost like more consistent or homogenous with each other, or is it that just as we are, diverse at our sort of level of conscious development in our behavior, that too exists at these higher levels, but I guess in what ways? And what I'm also trying to get at here is, what at the base level are the kind of core attributes of consciousness at large? Is it the sort of value, the underlying value to optimize for experience, sort of generally any experience, or is it, certain kinds of experience are, valued greater to a greater degree over other types of experience? Are we trending towards, sort of, kind of peaceful experience, or the maximization of peaceful interaction amongst conscious entities? Is that, a desired sort of trajectory, or is the trajectory a coexistence of a diversity of conscious experience? So I guess I do struggle with that, because there are, in my own background with faith and Christianity, this notion that is one sort of expression of Christian theology of, kind of heaven, where everything is a lot, essentially like homogenous with the will of God. Everyone's singing from the same hymn book, essentially. That to me doesn't sound all that exciting, other than, you might get some banging music out of it, but like, we don't have a lot of, where are the things that, from my perspective at least, bring, levels of enjoyment and value and excitement that derive from our differences and our disagreements. So this is sort of, in many ways, an argument for the value of disagreement. That it creates these friction points that give rise to, novel experience, new ideas, and these are things in and of themselves that are important to not only our lived experience, how we value the life that we have, but also our journey, our conscious journey, period. They add to our experience. They add and elevate that. So I don't know. I know I've said quite a lot there, but I mean, what's your take on that? Is it really going to be, sort of unidirectional, or is it omnidirectional in terms of what types of experiences are made manifest, across the spectrum?
Right. I mean, I think my the answer is yes and yes. Next question. No, I'm just joking. Um, what I mean by that is, yes, I agree with you that both of those things are valuable, and like we talked earlier about, trying to defend the marginalized while also maximizing free speech is a challenging equation, and we want to value both and recognize that there's challenges either way. So what I would say is that, that I'm a fan of Bernardo Kastrup's work, and he's talked about initially when you had this kind of cosmic intelligence, which was one intelligence, right, and that was everything. And then through a kind of process of disassociation, you have it breaking off into little units, subunits,
Mm-hmm.
where that created this sense of I-ness that was now disconnected from the totality, right? And that not only us as a species, but as us as individuals is a tiny, atomic structure representing a breakoff from that cosmic intelligence. And you could
Mm-hmm.
ask, well, why is that useful? Why would that even happen? And I would argue it's for the very reason you pointed to, this sense of it gives rise to creativity and novel experience and novel interpretation. And that while you have a nice, clean picture, when you have one intelligence that agrees with itself, it's not very dynamic and there's nowhere to grow. So, through this process
Mm.
of a disassociation, through species and individuals, there is this climbing back up the ladder then of having new experiences, novel experiences, creativity burgeoning in the cosmos, but also as part of that evolutionary process of consciousness itself, sort of regaining the memory that, wait a second, I'm from this thing. I broke off from this thing. And that's sort of like a non-dual perspective in terms of spirituality, is that you recognize that you're ultimately connected to everything. So it's kind of this beautiful experiment where you do value novel experience, you do value different perspectives. But while that happens and it gets more colorful, picture like a cuisine where you've got a menu with all these different, menu options from around the world. Who would want only Mexican food, or only, fish and chips in the UK or something? I mean,
Hmm.
or borscht, in Russia or whatever. I mean, you want all of that, right? That's when it gets really colorful and just erupting with flavor and diversity, right? That we value. And so, but as that continues to march up, ideally, you don't crush out the complexity, you don't crush out the differences, you value the differences. You have this much more robust, complex, interesting, multifaceted perspective that you bring all of that novelty while also moving to this remembrance that somehow it's all connected. So that's the ideal, I think, is that you go through that process of disassociation, you get novel experience, novel perspectives, but eventually you also find this kind of unifying um, march towards interconnectivity. And that seems like, in a nutshell, what I would say is the cosmic dance that we're a part of.
Thank you for breaking that down. Very helpful. I think I wanted to come back to, as we kind of turn our attention toward the back end of the show. I wanted to come back to something that we touched on earlier and that we've talked about in other conversations. But that is this notion of how we arrive at a consensus. Sort of generally, we could argue. Let's put a hypothetical. Eventually, let's say sometime in the next few years, we get a clear governmental statement, something that's unambiguous. That we're not alone. That here we have some craft we've been working on, and we think there's some species. We know at least of three. Just something that's more concrete than we have now. What are the ways that you foresee our sort of society and our discourse arriving at a kind of consensus that can kind of digest that information and say, yeah, that I also agree that is what is happening. I find it interesting that we have hot takes on everything, and even from those who are the most credentialed people in our societies, saying certain things to us, we are pretty quick to second guess that judgment and substitute a totally different narrative. Even though we don't have the kind of experience that they have. So, how do you see that playing out? Do you think there's going to be a very kind of public debate about this, that eventually we will kind of work our way toward a consensus, or will we kind of maybe forever be divided in some ways on what it really is?
Right. I think the interesting question within that question for me is, how much disclosure can you get without opening up more questions than you answered, right? And
Mm-hmm.
if we could just, I've used this, analogy of a cherry on top of, a cake or something. That always feels good, right? When you've got like 90% of a picture and then, there we go, perfecto. It's now it's fully complete. And we've talked about this before, kind of laughingly, at the end of the 19th century, the scientific revolution was fully in gear, and people would literally say things like, we're 99% there and understanding reality. Now it's just fine tuning. And then the quantum world erupted upon our psychic scapes, and everything was undone, right? And everything we thought we knew, we didn't know anymore. And I think to a great degree, we're still wrestling with that implication.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's funny how you'll hear different people making, again, really strong arguments one way or the other. So I remember even recently, reviewing some of um, Colonel Corso's work around Roswell and his frustration, that this wasn't being shared with the people, right? That, and he would, like, in indignation, say, the young people can handle it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I fought with 19-year-olds, and they fought the best, nations in the world, the best armies in the world, and they rose to the challenge. Why do our secret keepers believe that we can't handle it, right? And it's the whole Jack Nicholson thing. You can't handle the truth, right? I
Mm-hmm.
know better, so I'm going to withhold it from you. So on the one hand, you hear, again, we're going to argue for nuance here. On the one hand, you hear some people who say, um, we're mature, we can handle this, right? First problem with that is that it assumes there's a one us, right? Like, as if we are one human civilization, pretty much all have the same perspective, and we've already shown evidence that we can handle novel information in a healthy way, and sort of bring it into our worldview and spend a little time digesting, and then we move on as if there's no problem. But of course, that's not the nature of the world. And I actually think that's a naive perspective when people argue for that, because as we've talked about before in this show, and I've talked on POC about, uh, there's a reason why people say, for instance, when the Allies went to war, sort of with, or at least a Cold War or a kind of silent war against, Middle Eastern Islamic fundamentalism, they would call that a clash of civilizations, right? And in that
Mm-hmm.
expression itself, it demonstrates that you can have more than one civilization on the same planet at the same time. And we absolutely do. We have multiple ones. As I pointed out before, there are three main worldviews just within the United States, where people hold to very different notions of reality. So, what it means, the implications will be interpreted differently, digested, internalized differently, depending on which worldview you hold to. Um, and I don't know that if you say, well, it turns out these ones exist, we know they exist, and just, they happen to be popping in from a parallel reality.
Mm-hmm.
That says, what? Wait, there's other realities. What are
Right.
you saying? What does that mean for me? And are you saying there's another version of me, like, a million times over? And if I just don't like this life, should I just shut it down because maybe I'm better over there? I mean, it opens up so many questions, right? So again, if it's just ET, then that's somewhat simpler, right? Because it fits within our current paradigm, kind of our materialist space-time construct, where we say, turns out, sure enough, Alpha Centauri has this one system of 3 planets that are, like, highly evolved, and they've come here and they've been here for a long time, and in fact, they've been managing our evolution. We go, okay, that fits with our current paradigm of science and exploration. It feels very Star Trek-y, right? But
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty convinced the answer is much more complex than that. And of course, people like Jacques Vallée and John Keel came to that conclusion decades ago. And to a great degree, the world is still catching up to them based on the evidence they saw. Not because that was their preferred hypothesis. They actually began believing the ET hypothesis was probably most likely, because of that was the cultural milieu they grew up in, just like us. But the data convinced them otherwise, that it's much more complex than that. So for me, it answering one question in the affirmative opens up many, many troubling questions. The questions that people will perceive as troubling. It's a Pandora's box, right? If you say it turns out there are others here and they don't fit with our current model of what constitutes reality. I mean, is that going to be chaos? Is that going to be, you know, create a class of civilizations because one side, just like we talk about UFO Twitter, right? One side's convinced they're demonic, another side believes it's their love and light, another side believes they're kind of symbiotic ETs or interdimensionals. It's one thing when you have arguments on Twitter, when you have entire societies rallying around one perspective based on this new revelation, then they might very well feel that they're justified in going to war with each other because they're so convinced of their notion, and that this is if this is the end times, if this is the the rise of the Antichrist, and I'm justified in going to war with this other nation who doesn't see that, right? I mean, I'm not saying that's a right perspective. I'm saying some people will come to that conclusion. So
Mm-hmm.
tricky days ahead, for sure. I mean, it's but I guess you could argue that we are already in such tricky times with our tribalism and our capacity to destroy ourselves in many, many different ways, and how our technology has eclipsed our consciousness, the sort of center of consciousness, by such a degree that you almost could ask, is that instability that would inevitably come with these revelations actually potentially plant the seeds for something unifying that's actually better than what we have now? And is that maybe even the calculus that these others have taken into consideration, and that's why they're ramping up their presence? And then you think about Jacques Vallée's control system hypothesis and them doing just enough to manage our evolution, and that you shouldn't take anything at face value because it's more like a lever that's meant to shift our direction just enough to keep us alive and help to evolve our consciousness for the long term. So that was a very complex question, answer to your question. Sorry.
No, it's great. And you went exactly where I was about to go. And that is at each sort of epoch that we have been through on this planet, there are revelatory time periods that essentially lead to an apocalypse. The end of a way of experiencing, of knowing, of being arrives, and a new way is born. That there are some truths, there are some revelatory experiences that are so profound, so dynamic, that they literally end the civilization. And that is, I think, we often interpret that very flatly as like, everybody's wiped out and they're gone. But it's much more metaphorical. Like you can't go home again. um, Once you arrive at that place, you have only one option, and that's to go forward into a new future that is completely foreign to you. And it could very well be that's that we are on the precipice of that. Whether it strikes me whether that is sort of precipitated by the arrival of the others or disclosure, or whether it comes about through something of our own design. I was reminded recently, listening to an episode of the Lex Fridman podcast, where he was talking with someone about artificial intelligence, and just I think it was actually, I'm sorry, it was Sam Harris talking with Eric Schmidt about artificial intelligence, and just the degree to which we're already interacting with sort of a type of intelligence, not quite what we would call conscious, but it's doing things, and it will be capable of doing things that we really don't understand. Like the algorithms and the complexity of these systems are such that no one person really understands exactly how it's doing whatever it's doing. But it will dramatically change the way that we interact with our world on an individual and societal level. So we're at a time period in history where, one way or the other, it is not going to be the same as it has been in the past, and the future is going to get pretty weird, I think, pretty fast. And so, to sort of look at this from the perspective of, navigating that, and holding strong convictions and opinions, I think we're all going to be in a position where the things that we have held on to as being the kind of the beliefs that are the rocks for, that our houses, our foundations are built on, that those are all going to be challenged. So we really are going to have to, I think, prepare ourselves mentally for this arrival. and and you can't, just like you can't be prepared for the birth of your first child, you can't be prepared for this, but you can, do a few things to try and be prepared. You can get a little caught up. You can, prepare the nursery. You can get some clothes. You can do the kinds of things that make sense to do. And when we can kind of see it on the horizon, there are some things we can do right now, I think, that make sense. And hopefully we're paying attention enough to do that in a way that helps us navigate this transition in a safe and healthy way as possible, because we don't live on an island. We do rub shoulders and bump elbows all the time. So how do we kind of arrive at that point and cross that boundary without completely annihilating each other?
Yeah, and one of the reasons why that ever expanding circle of inclusion and concern that I mentioned earlier arises is not just because you just become more caring, but just as kind of a calculated understanding. You realize, for instance, with global warming and whatnot and climate, that what happens in one part of the world has direct effect on what happens somewhere else, and that you realize the only way we can solve a problem like that is by coming together and agreeing. And while some people will rally against the idea of globalism and as some sort of control structure meant to take away our individual freedoms, and I understand some of the concerns there, right? Again, I see validity on all sides. Usually I can see some validity in the different points of view. But at the same time, if we just isolate and say each group gets to do what they want and what they think's right, we may, not have much of a planet left to live within. Not to mention the responsibility we have for all the animal species and whatnot, the rest of the biosphere. Another thing that occurs to me too is that sometimes or often we're very comfortable saying change needs to happen, right? We need to move towards something that's like vastly different than it is now. It's not just a fine tuning. We need to completely revamp how we do civilization, right?
Hmm.
Many people are willing to say that. A much smaller group of people are willing to be the pioneers in those difficult transition times where you have to begin from the ground up. You have to strip down
Hmm.
everything you have had. We in the West have become, very comfortable with our material goods, our comfort. Um, we have certain expectations of how comfortable our life will be and a certain kind of repetition of uh, our schedule. And how much are we willing to have that impacted directly, us and our children and our grandchildren, in order to potentially build something new? Um,
Hmm.
that's part of this whole question around how far along really are we in terms of a non-dual kind of perspective. Can we be willing to be the first pioneers, moving on to the fresh territory where it's just really hard work and it's grunt work, maybe for your entire life, before you build up something new. And that kind of calculation, you see it happening all the time in our culture. When we have politicians that are elected for 4-year terms, then usually what they're most concerned with is what they can convince you they can do in 1, 2, 3 years. And then they're already thinking about the next election cycle, right? So the nature of reality doesn't run on 4-year cycles, but our political system currently does. Um, but how much of that are we willing to revamp and go through the complexity and the chaos of that revamping, where you tear down a structure before you build something new? That's a question I think we all have to ask ourselves, and it's something that involves sacrifice, personal sacrifice as well as collective sacrifice. And maybe that's even what some of these others, I mean, I'm pretty sure that's partly what they're saying, is trying to point out our hypocrisy and the small way we live our lives. And like I said, with that political science teacher or the sociology teacher earlier, again, by them showing up, that in itself makes us ask new questions. It makes us see ourselves differently, makes us see ourselves as human beings rather than Republicans or Democrats or North Americans or Africans or whatever. Um, yeah, big questions, and I really encourage all of us to think hard about how much we would be willing to sacrifice to solve some of the problems that exist. Because if we only opt for options that supposedly bring about solutions without changing any of the current dynamics in any major way. I'm reminded of what Einstein said, where he said, you can never solve a current problem from the same level of consciousness that developed it in the first place. I think that applies here as well.
It, so well said. This reminds me of just relationships and how, as you pointed out, what are you willing to sacrifice? What are you willing to do to repair the breach? To break new ground. And I see the parallels directly with this topic of conversation. The notion of disagreement. What are you willing? How vulnerable are you willing to be to come to a new place, a new understanding? So disagreements are, I think, healthy. They're very good. They often, spark, new insights. I think a healthy community does have space and has made space for people to express different opinions. But we do also need to encourage this notion of growth and sacrifice and vulnerability, because that is a catalyst for change. And I have this mental image of not only the pioneers amongst us who may have to make these sacrifices in this new reality, but those from the other side, who may have to make their own sacrifices to kind of reach out and bring us along. So this is very much, I would hope at least, is a two-way street here, that it is highly relational, that just as we are willing to be changed, they are willing to be changed, in service of something more, of a new way of understanding, a new way of being. That is the not only kind of the transformative quality of genuine relationship, but it's the transformative power of what this represents. This is the dawn of a new way of being in the world, and it impacts us on an individual, a familial, a societal, a global, level. And it's exciting. Again, whether it happens tomorrow, or a decade, or in future lifetimes, I think we would agree that it's going to happen on some level, that eventually this barrier will break, and that new world will arrive.
Well said. That's a great note to finish on.
Yeah, with that said, so we again really appreciate all of our listeners. I can't thank all of you enough for the times that you've shared the show and mentioned it to others, the times that you've made a comment or responded on Twitter or on YouTube or even on Reddit. I saw some posts there. So a shout out to all the folks that have given our show a chance and are following along. I can say personally that this has been an incredibly meaningful journey for me, to have these conversations with you, Exo, and with this community. And we look forward to seeing where it will go. We do think that there's a lot of ground left to cover here, a lot of discovery left to be had. And with that said, as we close, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see y'all next time on Liminal Frames.